The scent of sawdust and old grief hung heavy in the workshop, a place where 7-year-old Matteo felt a forbidden magic. He sat on the cold concrete floor, a small figure lost among the looming shadows of saws and sanders. In his tiny hands, he clutched one of his grandfather's most prized carving tools, its worn wooden handle smooth against his skin. He wasn't damaging it. He was giving it a purpose beyond its silent, dusty rest. With intense focus, he scraped away at a small block of pine, trying to coax the shape of a bird from the wood. It was a secret act of creation in a house that only valued destruction and repair. He didn't hear the heavy footsteps approaching, didn't sense the storm gathering behind him until a large, calloused hand snatched the tool away, the metal clattering loudly as it hit the floor. Richard's face was a mask of thunder. His eyes, clouded by years of unspoken sorrow for the son he'd lost, now fixed on his grandson with a terrifying clarity. He saw not a child's innocent play, but a repeat of a history he despised. He saw his own son, the musician, the dreamer, reborn in this fragile boy who preferred pencils to hammers. "What did I tell you about touching my things?" he roared, his voice echoing off the bare walls. Matteo shrank back, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. In the doorway stood his grandmother, Martha, a pale silhouette wrapped in a shawl of silence. Her hands were clasped, her face a portrait of helpless fear, a silent accomplice to the cruelty about to unfold. Have you ever seen someone you love do nothing to protect you? The grandfather's rage was a physical force. He grabbed Matteo by his thin arm, his grip like a vice, and hauled him from the workshop. The boy's feet stumbled to keep up as he was dragged through the cold, quiet house. He didn't cry out. The shock had stolen his voice. He could only watch as the front door was wrenched open, revealing a grey, unforgiving afternoon. "A boy who's good for nothing has no place in this house," Richard spat, the words hitting Matteo with more force than a physical blow. He shoved the child out onto the porch, a violent, final push. Matteo tumbled down the 2 short steps, landing hard on the cracked pavement. The small, half-finished wooden bird fell from his pocket, landing beside him like a broken promise. Then came the sound that would echo in his nightmares for years, the solid, definitive slam of the heavy oak door, the click of the lock turning. Silence. Matteo scrambled to his feet, his palms scraped and bleeding, and stared at the door. It was just wood and paint, but it had become a fortress, an impassable wall between him and the only family he had left. The world, which had once been the size of his grandfather's house, suddenly expanded into an infinite, terrifying emptiness. The wind whipped at his thin sweater, a cold that seeped not just into his skin, but into his very soul. He was a tiny ship cast adrift in a vast, indifferent ocean, with no land in sight. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his small chest heaving with silent sobs. The words, "good for nothing," circled in his mind, a poison seeping into his 7-year-old heart. He looked down at his own small hands, wondering what was so wrong with them. He wasn't strong like his grandfather. He couldn't build things. All he could do was draw sad little figures on scraps of paper and try to carve birds from discarded wood. He just wanted to be loved, to be seen, to belong somewhere. Was that too much to ask? Behind that closed door, Richard did not feel victory. He felt a hollow, echoing calm. He stood with his broad back pressed against the wood, as if to hold back the world he had just banished. In his mind, he hadn't thrown out a 7-year-old boy. He had exorcised a ghost, the ghost of his son, Daniel, whose gentle hands preferred the neck of a guitar to the handle of a hammer. That same sensitivity, that same useless preoccupation with creating delicate things from nothing, had reappeared in Matteo. Richard saw it not as a gift, but as a hereditary disease, a weakness that had, in his mind, led his own son to ruin. He believed this act of cruelty was a form of medicine, a brutal surgery to save the boy from a fate he couldn't bear to witness a second time. Richard's entire life was built on the principle of utility. He was a man who measured his worth in solid, tangible things, houses framed, cabinets joined, roofs that withstood the fiercest storms. His hands were a testament to a life of labor, calloused and scarred, but capable. Daniel had been a profound disappointment, a son who spoke a language of chords and melodies that Richard could not, and would not, understand. He saw the artist's life as one of poverty and instability, a flight from the real work of being a man. The arguments had been constant, a bitter war of attrition that left both father and son wounded. Now, in Matteo, he saw not his grandson, but his son's final, defiant ghost, and he was determined to win the war he had already lost. In the hallway, Martha stood frozen, a statue carved from fear. Her hands were clenched in the folds of her apron, knuckles white. She was not a monster. She was a woman who had spent 50 years learning the geography of her husband's anger and the art of making herself small to avoid its storms. Her silence was not consent, but a lifelong reflex of self-preservation. A part of her screamed to run, to snatch the boy back from the cold, but the fear of Richard was an older, more powerful force. It was the same silence that had watched Daniel pack his guitar and leave home at 18. The same silence that had swallowed the words, "I love you," 1,000 times. Her inaction was a cage built from decades of quiet compromises, and now another soul was lost because of it. The accident that took Daniel and his wife had been a cruel, random tragedy, but in Richard's grief-shattered mind, it became a validation. It was proof that a life spent chasing dreams on dimly lit stages was fragile, irresponsible, and ultimately fatal. He clung to this distorted logic because it was the only way to make sense of the senseless. It was easier to blame his son's choices than to face the crushing randomness of death. When he saw Matteo in the workshop, so much like Daniel, carving a bird with a tool meant for building, he didn't see a child playing. He saw the beginning of the end all over again. He was not just a grandfather. He was a man desperately trying to rewrite history, even if it meant destroying the present. The silence that fell upon the house after the door slammed was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an evening's rest. It was the dead, suffocating silence of a tomb. Richard finally moved away from the door and walked to his workshop. But the scent of sawdust now seemed like dust from a grave. He picked up a hammer, its weight familiar, but his purpose was gone. He had silenced the ghost, but the house was now haunted by something far worse, what he had done. Martha watched him go, the space between them filled with a terrible, unspoken knowledge. They had taken in the last piece of their son, and in their fear and bitterness, they had broken it. They were alone now, truly alone, locked in a prison of their own making. From that day on, the house became a museum of regret. Richard spent his days sanding wood that would never be assembled, creating a fine dust that settled on everything, a pale shroud over their lives. He had proven his point, that strength was all that mattered, but his victory felt like ash in his mouth. Martha would find Matteo's small, forgotten drawings tucked into books or under cushions, each one a tiny paper cut to her soul. They never spoke of the boy. His name became the most forbidden of words. They had cut him out of their lives, believing they were cutting away the pain of the past, but instead, they had only severed their own connection to the future. Have you ever seen someone destroy their own heart, just to prove they were right? The first night was a lesson in how the world could shrink and expand all at once. The alley he found was a narrow crack between two brick buildings, a space so small it felt like a coffin, yet the city around it was a monstrous, breathing entity of endless noise and shadow. Every distant siren, every shout, every rattle of a garbage can lid was a predator stalking him in the dark. The cold was a living thing, a predator of a different kind. It slithered through the thin fabric of his sweater, wrapped its icy fingers around his ribs, and squeezed until his teeth chattered uncontrollably. Hunger was a hollow ache that grew into a sharp, twisting pain. He curled into a ball, pulling his knees to his chest, trying to remember the feeling of a blanket, the memory of warmth, already a distant, fading dream. He was an island of forgotten flesh in a sea of concrete. The dawn brought no relief, only a harsh, grey light that exposed his shame to the world. He watched people walk by, their faces closed, their steps purposeful. They were heading to warm places, to lives he could no longer imagine. He was invisible, a piece of urban debris no more significant than a discarded newspaper. The hunger had become a desperate, primal urge, silencing every other thought. He saw a half-eaten sandwich in an overflowing trash bin, and for a moment he hesitated. The memory of his grandmother's clean kitchen a painful ghost, but the gnawing in his stomach was stronger than any memory. He snatched it, his small hands trembling. And ate it in the shadows, the taste of shame and survival mingling on his tongue. He was no longer a boy. He was a creature learning the brutal rules of a new existence. That night, the dream came for the first time. It was always the same. He would be standing on the porch, his small hand outstretched, not begging, just waiting, and the heavy oak door would begin to close, not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate finality. There was no sound in the dream. Only the sight of the widening gap of darkness and the final, heart-stopping click of the lock. He would wake with a choked gasp, his body slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the night air. The alley was still there. The city still hummed its menacing lullaby, but the terror from the dream was a deeper cold, a freeze that started in his soul. He now understood that some doors, once closed, could never be opened again, not even in your sleep. He lasted 2 more days. His world became a blur of hunger, fear, and a bone-deep weariness that made his small legs feel like lead. He was fading, a ghost in the making, when a soft yellow light cut through the evening gloom. It came from the window of a small shop, its sign barely legible, Elvira's Emporium of Forgotten Words. It looked warm. Inside, towers of books leaned like ancient sleeping giants. It was the last thing he saw clearly before his legs gave out, and the world dissolved into a merciful darkness. He didn't feel the cold pavement this time, only a sense of falling, of finally letting go. If you had found a child collapsed on your doorstep, what would your first thought have been? Would it be fear or compassion? He awoke to the scent of old paper, lemon tea and dust. He was on a small cot behind a counter, a thick, scratchy wool blanket tucked around him. An old woman with eyes the color of faded denim and hair like spun silver was watching him. She didn't ask his name or where he came from. She simply placed a steaming mug of soup into his trembling hands. Her name was Elvira, and her kindness was a quiet, unassuming thing, offered without question or expectation. For Matteo, who had only known love that came with conditions and anger that came without warning, this simple act of unconditional care was both terrifying and miraculous. He drank the soup, the warmth spreading through him, and for the first time in days, he felt something other than fear. Elvira led him up a creaking spiral staircase to a tiny room tucked under the eaves of the bookstore. It was little more than a closet, with a sloped ceiling, a small, round window that looked out onto the rooftops, and a thin mattress on the floor. To Matteo, it was a kingdom. It was a space that was his, a place with a door that could be closed but not locked against him. Still, he couldn't shake the terror. He watched Elvira's every move, waiting for the shift in her eyes, the change in her tone that would signal the end of his sanctuary. He expected her to demand something, to tell him he was useless, to cast him out again. This new, fragile safety felt like a dream he was afraid to wake from. Their life together was a quiet tapestry, woven with threads of poverty. Some days, their meals consisted of little more than watered-down soup and bread that was a day or two past its prime. The bookstore rarely had customers, and the coins Elvira collected in a small jar by the register were few. Matteo learned the silent language of the store, the gentle creak of the floorboards, the soft rustle of turning pages. He remained a ghost among the shelves, speaking no words, his voice locked away with the trauma of the oak door. The hunger was a familiar companion, but it was different now. It was a shared hardship, a quiet understanding that passed between the old woman and the silent boy, and in its own strange way, it was a bond. He was known in the neighborhood simply as the bookstore boy, a strange, silent child who was always there, peering out from behind stacks of books like a timid forest creature. Other children, on their way home from school, would sometimes press their faces against the glass, pointing and whispering. He was a mystery, a boy without a past, and their curiosity felt like a weapon, each stare a small cut that reminded him he didn't belong. He learned to make himself smaller, to retreat deeper into the labyrinth of shelves, finding solace not with people, but with the characters in the stories. They were his only friends. Their fictional sorrows a safe distance from his own raw, unspoken pain. Have you ever felt so alone that even a crowd feels like a desert? His silence was a dam holding back a flood of pain, and the only cracks through which it could escape were his drawings. He found scraps of paper in discarded books, the blank insides of covers. even old receipts from the cash register. With a stub of a pencil Elvira had given him, he began to draw his world. They were not the drawings of a child. They were stark and shadowed, filled with solitary figures huddled against vast, empty backgrounds. He drew doors, hundreds of them, all closed, all with heavy, ornate locks. He drew a small bird with a broken wing, lying on cold pavement. It was his only language, a desperate, silent scream rendered in graphite and sorrow, a way to show the hurt he could not speak. The deepest wound was invisible. It was the quiet, constant whisper in his mind that echoed his grandfather's final words, good for nothing. He had been weighed, measured, and found wanting by the very people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. This belief became the foundation of his new reality. He saw Elvira's gentle care not as affection, but as pity, a temporary charity she would surely rescind once she realized how broken he was. Every night, as he lay on his small mattress, he braced himself for the morning when she would tell him to leave. The fear of abandonment was a poison that tainted every moment of safety, a constant reminder that he was not worthy of a permanent home. Mateo's world became the dusty, silent bookstore. It was his shelter, his hiding place, and his prison. He had a roof over his head, but his heart remained unsheltered, exposed to the relentless storm inside him. He was surrounded by thousands of voices trapped in the pages of books, yet he had lost his own. The silence he lived in was more than just an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a heavy cloak of shame, grief, and the profound, crushing knowledge that when the door had slammed shut, no one on the inside had tried to open it for him. He was safe, he was fed, but the boy who loved to carve birds from wood had been left behind on that porch, frozen in time. Elvira watched him for weeks, a small ghost who haunted the aisles of her store. His only language the frantic scratching of a pencil stub on the back of old receipts. She saw the drawings not as childish scribbles, but as dispatches from a silent war. One afternoon, after selling a rare first edition that left a few extra dollars in her tin, she did something unexpected. She returned not with more bread or soup, but with a sketchbook bound in black cloth and a small box of charcoal pencils. She placed them on the counter without a word, a silent offering. Mateo stared at them, his eyes wide. The paper was clean, smooth, and terrifyingly empty. It was a promise he didn't understand, a gift without a visible price. Sometimes the most profound acts of love aren't spoken, they're simply given. For 3 days, the sketchbook lay untouched. To Mateo, it was a trap. Kindness, in his world, was a currency used to buy obedience, and he had nothing left to give. He watched Elvira from behind the shelves, his small body tense, waiting for her patience to snap. He expected her to demand why he wasn't using her gift, to call him ungrateful, to finally reveal the anger he was certain all adults hid just beneath the surface. He had learned a brutal lesson. Using something that wasn't his, creating something for himself, led to exile. The ghost of his grandfather's prized tool haunted his hands. How do you accept a gift when you've been taught that your very touch is a form of destruction? He couldn't yet believe this wasn't another test he was doomed to fail. The change happened not in the daylight, but in the deep, quiet hours of the night, when the city was asleep and his fears were loudest. In the pale moonlight filtering through his small round window, he finally opened the book. The crisp scent of the paper rose to meet him. He picked up a charcoal pencil, its weight solid and real in his hand. His first drawing wasn't of a bird or a tree. He drew the door, the heavy oak door from his nightmares, but this time he was the one in control. He defined its shadows, etched the grain of the wood, and drew the lock, heavy and absolute. It was still a monument to his pain, but now the pain was his to command on the page. It wasn't a scream anymore. It was a statement. He left the sketchbook open, a careless mistake born of exhaustion. The next morning, he crept downstairs, his heart pounding with the dread of discovery. He saw Elvira standing behind the counter, looking at the drawing of the door. He braced for the questions, the pity, the gentle suggestion that he draw something happier. Instead, she looked at him, her faded blue eyes holding not sorrow, but a deep, quiet respect. With the careful precision of a museum curator, she gently tore the page from its spiral binding and pinned it to a small, cluttered corkboard behind the register. It was the first piece of his art that had ever been displayed. He wasn't just the silent boy she had taken in, he was an artist. Have you ever had a moment when someone saw not what was broken in you, but what was beautiful? That single pin on the corkboard changed everything. It was permission. It was a declaration that his story mattered. The dam of his silence didn't break with words, but with a flood of charcoal and graphite. He began to draw his life, page after page. He drew the alley, the menacing shadows, long and sharp like teeth. He drew a pair of small, worn-out shoes, waiting on a porch for a door that would never open. He drew a boy curled into a ball, so small he almost disappeared into the darkness. The drawings were raw and steeped in sorrow, but they were also fiercely alive. He was taking the ugliest moments of his life and transforming them into something other people could see, could feel. He was learning that a voice doesn't have to make a sound to be heard. The boy who believed he was good for nothing was beginning to suspect he might be good for something. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a slow, fragile dawn. He started to help Elvira stack the books, his small hands careful and precise. Sometimes he would even meet the gaze of a customer for a fleeting second before looking away. The nightmares of the closing door still visited him, but they were changing. Sometimes, in the dream, he would notice a small, round window beside the door, a faint yellow light glowing from within, a light that looked a lot like Elvira's bookstore. He wasn't healed, not yet, but a seed had been planted in the barren soil of his heart. Sometimes, all a child needs is someone who says, "I believe in you." The world outside the bookstore began to knock, gently at first. A local art professor, a kind man named Alistair, with eyes that saw more than just surfaces, became a regular visitor. He'd seen Matteo's drawings pinned behind the register and recognized the raw, untaught power bleeding from them. He spoke of a scholarship to a prestigious art school for young people, a place where Matteo's voice could become a roar. The word scholarship was a foreign sound, a promise of a world Matteo never dared to imagine. For Elvira, it was a prayer answered. For Matteo, it was a terrifying new weight. Hope, he was learning, could be just as heavy as despair, because it gave you so much more to lose. The pressure mounted in silence. Elvira, her face alight with a fierce, quiet pride, used the last of her savings to buy him a set of professional-grade charcoal sticks and thick, textured paper. Mr. Alistair started giving him assignments, talking about portfolios and composition. Suddenly, his art was no longer a secret language between him and his pain. It was a performance for an audience. Every line he drew felt judged, every shadow measured. The sketchbook, once his sanctuary, now felt like a witness to his inadequacy. The joy he'd found in creation was slowly being choked by the fear of not being good enough. The old words echoed in the quiet of the attic. Good for nothing. What if they finally saw it, too? Then the outside world broke in, not with a knock, but with a shove. A group of older boys from the neighborhood, who had long watched the silent bookstore ghost, decided he was their sport. They cornered him one afternoon, their laughter sharp and cruel. They snatched his sketchbook, flipping through the pages with mocking jeers. "Look at the creepy drawings," one sneered, before callously ripping the pages out and throwing them into a grimy puddle on the sidewalk. Matteo stood frozen, watching his soul, his doors, his broken birds, his shadowy figures dissolve into the murky water. The physical sting of being pushed was nothing compared to the agony of seeing his voice silenced so violently. That night, the dam broke. The taunts of the bullies, freak, ghost, trash, became a chorus, singing in harmony with his grandfather's final verdict. Every fear he had fought to keep at bay flooded back in a tidal wave of self-loathing. He saw himself as they saw him, a strange, broken boy who drew sad, ugly things. The new, expensive paper Elvira had bought him sat on his small desk, its blankness an accusation. He couldn't touch it. He retreated completely, becoming the ghost they called him, a silent shadow in the attic. The fragile hope Elvira and Alistair had so carefully built was shattered, and all that remained were the original ruins of his heart. Have you ever felt a new wound tear open an old scar? Elvira found him curled on his mattress, staring at the wall, the vibrant city outside his window reduced to a meaningless blur. She didn't ask what was wrong. She knew wounds like his didn't respond to questions. Instead, she sat on the floor beside him, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable. After a long while, she picked up a worn copy of an old epic. She didn't read it to him, but simply spoke of the hero's shield. She described how it was not the polished, pristine shields that were honored, but the ones covered in dents and scratches. Each mark tells a story of a battle survived, she whispered. Your art is your shield, Matteo. Don't be ashamed of the dents. But her words were a distant comfort against the immediate, screaming pain of his failure. The scholarship deadline was approaching like an executioner's footstep. Mr. Alistair stopped by, his kind face clouded with a disappointment that felt sharper than any anger. That was the final blow. Matteo couldn't bear the thought of failing them, of seeing their belief in him curdle into pity. That night, under the cold gaze of the moon, he made a decision. He packed a small, pathetic bag, a stale piece of bread, his worn sweater. It would be better to disappear, to become the ghost everyone thought he was, than to stay and prove them right. It was easier to run back to the familiar darkness than to face the blinding light of their expectations. He crept down the spiral stairs, each creak a betrayal of Elvira's trust. His hand rested on the cold brass doorknob of the bookstore's front door. This was it, the escape. But as he prepared to pull it open, he caught his own reflection in the dark glass. He saw a thin, haunted boy about to willingly step back into the cold. And in that moment, he didn't see the bookstore door. He saw the other one. The heavy, unyielding oak door of his past. A horrifying thought seized him. He was about to do to himself exactly what his grandfather had done. He was choosing to lock himself out. You can run from the person who hurt you. But what do you do when you become that person yourself? A tremor went through him, a seismic shift deep in his soul. It wasn't courage, not yet. It was rage, a pure, cold fury at the bullies, at his grandfather, and most of all, at the terrified boy in the reflection who was about to surrender. He was not that helpless child on the porch anymore. He had survived. He had a shield, dented and scarred as it was, and he had a weapon, a stick of charcoal. He let go of the doorknob, the decision solidifying in his bones. He turned his back on the street and walked back up the stairs, not to his bed, but to the blank, accusing paper. He would not run. He would fight. He drew through the entire night, fueled by a frantic, desperate energy. This was not for the scholarship. This was for his life. He didn't draw the pretty landscapes Mr. Alistair had suggested. He drew the ugly truth. He drew the sneering faces of the boys, their mouths twisted into monstrous shapes. He drew his own drawing sinking into a filthy puddle, the ink like black blood. He drew a small boy's hand reaching for a brass doorknob, his reflection a ghost in the glass. He poured every ounce of his humiliation, his fear, and his rage onto the page. The pain was no longer just a memory to be endured. It was the very material of his art. He had fallen, but something inside him refused to stay on the ground. 11 years had passed. The air in the gallery was not filled with the scent of sawdust and grief, but with the clean, sharp smell of white paint and the quiet hum of cultured appreciation. Matteo, now 18, stood at the center of the room, not a small figure lost in shadows, but a calm, magnetic presence bathed in the warm glow of track lighting. He wore a simple black shirt. His hands, no longer small and trembling, gestured with a quiet confidence as he spoke about his work. He was explaining a piece, a charcoal rendering of a boy's face reflected in a murky puddle, and his voice was low and steady. The boy who had lost his voice was now telling his story to a room full of strangers, and they were listening. At the gallery's entrance, two figures hesitated, their old bodies silhouetted against the bright street outside. Richard and Martha were ghosts from another lifetime. Age had stooped Richard's powerful shoulders, and the hands that had once snapped tools and slammed doors now trembled with a persistent tremor. Martha, smaller and more fragile than ever, clung to his arm, her face a roadmap of regret. It was she who had seen the article in the paper, the familiar last name a jolt to her heart. She had convinced him to come, a final, desperate pilgrimage for an absolution she knew they didn't deserve. They stepped inside, two relics entering a museum of their own making. They didn't see him at first. They saw the walls, and the walls screamed their sins back at them. The first piece they saw was a small, devastatingly simple canvas, a pair of a child's worn-out shoes, sitting alone on the top step of a porch. To the other patrons, It was a poignant image of childhood loss. To Richard and Martha, it was a photograph of their crime. They moved deeper into the room, a slow, agonizing procession past their own history. There was a drawing of a boy curled in an alley, his form almost consumed by shadows that looked like grasping hands. Martha brought a hand to her mouth. A choked sound caught in her throat. Each piece was a nail driven into the coffin of their denial. Then they saw the centerpiece of the exhibition. It was a massive, hyper-realistic oil painting titled The Lock. It depicted nothing more than a pair of hands, large, calloused, scarred, turning the deadbolt on a heavy oak door. They were Richard's hands, rendered with such unforgiving detail that he could see the dirt under the fingernails, the worn pattern of the skin over the knuckles. He stared at the painting, and his own hands began to shake uncontrollably. This was his legacy, not the houses he had built or the furniture he had crafted, but this single brutal act of closing a door, immortalized in paint for the world to see. He had been so proud of his hands, and now he saw them for what they were, instruments of cruelty. His gaze finally lifted from the painting, sweeping across the crowded room until it found him. He saw a young man, tall and composed, accepting a compliment from a well-dressed woman. He saw the faint echo of his son, Daniel, in the line of his jaw, but the eyes were different. They were not the soft, dreamy eyes of the musician, nor the terrified eyes of the 7-year-old boy. They were the eyes of a survivor, clear and steady, holding a depth of knowledge that Richard could never comprehend. The uselessness he had so violently rejected had been forged in the fire of that rejection into this undeniable power, the entire foundation of his life. His belief in strength and utility crumbled into dust. And then Matteo saw them. His conversation faltered for a fraction of a second. The glass in his hand clinked softly. Across the room, through the moving bodies of strangers, his eyes met his grandfather's. For a heartbeat, the confident artist vanished, and he was 7 years old again, standing on a cold porch, the world an infinite, terrifying emptiness. The old fear, a phantom limb, ached within him. But it was only a ghost. He held their gaze, his expression unreadable, a calm sea over a deep ocean of memory. He didn't smile, he didn't scowl, he simply saw them. The power had shifted so completely, it was almost a physical force in the room. He was no longer the boy waiting for a door to open. He was the man who had built a new world for himself on the other side. Martha's composure finally shattered. A sob, silent and violent, shook her entire frame. It was a sound she had swallowed for 11 years, a sound of profound, bottomless shame. The boy they had thrown away had not only survived, he had triumphed. He had taken the ugliest thing they had ever done and turned it into something beautiful and true, something that people paid to witness. Her silence had been her sin, a passive cruelty that had allowed this to happen. Now, in the face of his strength, her silence was her punishment, for there were no words in any language that could ever bridge the chasm they had created. She hid her face in her hands, her frail body trembling with the weight of it all. Matteo watched them for another long moment. He saw the collapsed ruin of the man who had called him worthless. He saw the weeping woman whose fear had cost him everything. He could have walked over, he could have screamed, or cried, or offered a forgiveness they hadn't earned. But he did none of those things. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement, an acknowledgement that they were a part of his story, the dark soil from which he had grown. Then he deliberately turned his back on them, returning his attention to the woman beside him, his voice calm as he began to speak again. He was choosing his present. He was choosing his life. Would you have had the strength to do the same? They left the gallery as they had arrived, as ghosts. Richard leaned heavily on Martha, his face ashen, the tremor in his hands now a violent shudder. He looked like a man who had just seen his own obituary. They stepped out of the warm light of the gallery and into the encroaching darkness of the evening, disappearing into the city that had once tried to swallow their grandson. Inside, Matteo stood surrounded by his truth, his scars transformed into art, his silence now a roar that filled the room. He had been rejected by the family that should have loved him, but he had been found by a world that saw his worth. What is the true meaning of family? Is it the blood you share, Or the people who see the light in you when all you feel is darkness? The gallery slowly emptied, the polite applause and murmurs of praise fading into a respectful quiet. Matteo stood alone among his creations, the silence now a comfortable blanket, not a suffocating void. He didn't feel the thrill of victory or the bitter satisfaction of revenge. He felt only a profound, quiet stillness, as if a storm that had raged inside him for 11 years had finally passed. The ghosts of Richard and Martha were gone, not vanquished, but simply rendered powerless. He realized he hadn't created this art for them. He hadn't painted his pain to accuse them, but to reclaim it. Their judgment, their apology, their presence. It was all irrelevant. The validation he had craved his entire life wasn't theirs to give. He had already given it to himself, stroke by stroke, on each of these canvases. Years later, the scent of charcoal and turpentine filled a different kind of room, a brightly lit classroom at a community center. Matteo, his hands now dusted with color, moved between tables of children, their faces a mixture of concentration and frustration. He didn't teach them how to draw perfect lines, he taught them how to draw their feelings. In the corner, a small girl with haunted eyes sat staring at a blank page, her pencil untouched. Matteo didn't push. He simply pulled up a chair beside her and began to sketch on his own pad, drawing a small locked door. After a moment, the girl picked up her pencil and, with a trembling hand, drew a tiny key. He had become Elvira. He was now the keeper of forgotten words, offering paper and a pencil as a lifeline to children adrift in their own silent seas. The house on the old street remained, but it was no longer a home. It was a tomb, suffocating under the weight of unspoken regret. Richard spent his final years in his workshop. Surrounded by tools he no longer had the strength or the will to use. He would sit for hours, staring at his own trembling, empty hands, the hands from the painting, seeing them not as instruments of creation, but of destruction. Martha would move through the silent rooms like a shadow, dusting furniture that no one ever used, her life a long, quiet penance. They never spoke of the gallery, never spoke of the boy. Their punishment was not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, hollow erosion of the soul, a life sentence served in a prison of their own making, with only the ghosts of their choices for company. The bookstore, however, was more alive than ever. With the money from his art, Matteo had helped Elvira fix the leaky roof and install bright, warm lighting. The sign outside now read, Elvira and Matteo's Emporium of Found Words. It was his true home, the place his heart had chosen. Some afternoons, they would sit together in the quiet space and sipping tea, the silence between them a testament to a love built not on blood, but on shared hardship and unconditional acceptance. This was the family he had built. It wasn't a replacement for the one he had lost. It was the real thing, a foundation forged in kindness, strong enough to withstand any storm. He had learned that a house is just wood and nails, but a home is a place where your soul is seen and valued. One evening in his studio, the small attic room he had kept exactly as it was, he found a small, dusty box. Inside was the crude, half-finished wooden bird he had carved as a child, its wing still broken. He picked it up, the pine worn smooth with time. For years, this object had been a symbol of his rejection, a painful reminder of his uselessness. But now, holding it in the palm of his hand, he saw it differently. He saw not the end of his childhood, but the beginning of his identity. It was not a broken thing, it was a seed. It was the first, clumsy attempt of an artist to give form to the beauty he saw in the world. He hadn't been destroyed on that porch. He had been planted. The world had tried to tell him he was good for nothing, a boy to be thrown away like scrap wood, but it had been wrong. His worth was never in his grandfather's hands to define. He had taken the splinters of his abandonment and built a life of purpose. He took the silence they had condemned him to and turned it into a language that moved the world. The heavy oak door that haunted his dreams was now just a memory, a closed chapter in a book he had learned to write himself. He was rejected by those who were supposed to love him, but he was found and saved by the art that lived within. His story was proof that the deepest wounds don't have to be endings. Sometimes they are where the light gets in.